Okay, it's a few minutes after our hour. I think we're ready to get started. Hello again, everyone. Welcome to the May National NBS Pilot webinar. We are excited today. We have a great speaker. This is just some housekeeping. Please, this is an open forum, so please feel free to unmute yourself if you have a question, but also be respectful and mute yourself while the speaker is presenting. And then I also want to remind everybody that these calls are recorded and posted on the NBS TRN YouTube channel, as well as our website. Here is our agenda for today. We are very happy. We have a very special speaker, and I'm going to pass over to my colleague, May Leach, to do the introduction.
So hello and welcome Dr. Ki Chan. So Dr. Ki Chan received her PhD in epidemiology and public health from Yale University. Her PhD dissertation was focused on the development of a newborn screening test for severe combined immunodeficiency, or SCID. As of 2021, all the states in the US have implemented newborn screening for SCID to screen for over 4 million babies every year. Dr. Chan conducted this research at the National Human Genome Research Institute at the National Institutes of Health, NIH. After NIH, Dr. Chan served as a health economist and research investigator at the Department of Veterans Affairs in Massachusetts. She conducted business case analysis, cost effectiveness analysis, and policy modeling on HIV, hepatitis C, newborn screening, and genomics. She has held faculty appointments at several universities where she taught courses on public health, genomics, management, and leadership. She is also a certified instructional designer for online learning. Dr. Chan joined NBS TRN as a scientific strategy manager. Her role involves building new strategic partnerships with academia, nonprofit organizations, governmental agencies, and industries to expand the NBS TRN network. Dr. Chan leads a working group with different stakeholders to advance newborn screening research into public health practice and implementation. Dr. Chan has given workshops on effective communication and is serving as a public health relations NBS TRN staff to amplify the voices of stakeholders involved in newborn screening research. So welcome Dr. Ki Chan. She will be presenting on an introduction to modeling and newborn screening pilots. And I think we're also going to have a short poll right now.
Yes, I'm going to display the poll on the screen. We're asking everyone to fill out this poll so we can see who has been attending these calls. I'm going to leave it up for a few minutes so I can get as many people as possible to answer this question. So if you answer the question, just there should be an X where you can exit out and so you can see the speaker. So please answer the poll question. Thank you. And Ki, I'm going to stop sharing my screen so you can go ahead and share yours.
Great.
Dr. Chan, are you able to share or?
Oh yeah, I'm pulling it up.
Okay, just making sure.
Yeah. Are we good?
Yep, we're good to go.
All right.
Thank you for the opportunity to present the use of models in newborn screening expansion. Prior to my time at ACMG working with the newborn screening translational research team, I was a faculty member teaching public health management and conducted research focused on the development of models to evaluate public health programs. I'm excited to introduce the purpose of models and how we, as a newborn screening community, can consider using modeling to help advance our work in advocacy, health outcomes, newborn screening expansion, and newborn screening practice. Please type your questions in the chat window and hold them until the end of the presentation for the Q&A session. Let's begin a brief history of newborn screening to set the stage for the use of models in newborn screening expansion. The numbers of conditions included in newborn screening has increased from 1 to over 30, and it has been due to the discovery of novel technologies to screen, diagnose, treat, and manage diseases that lead to more conditions being candidates for newborn screening. Research helps to develop these technologies and understand their use in newborn screening through prospective or retrospective studies, usually called pilots. State newborn screening programs determine which conditions to screen in their state and conduct pilots of these new analytical technologies as they implement screening. The use of models can help in several ways, including helping advocacy groups working to expand newborn screening, researchers developing new therapy, and state newborn programs as they expand their panels. Today, I will begin with a brief introduction to models and then remind you about some of the NBS2N tools and resources that can help you as you consider using models in your efforts. The first question you may be thinking is, what is modeling? In short, it is a process of using existing data to create models for predictive or analytical value. So why use modeling as a strategy in your work? Well, models can project population-level health outcomes by using existing data to create for predictive or analytical value. We have all been impacted by policies informed by models during the COVID-19 pandemic. This image illustrates a model to project the impact of a vaccination on new deaths. You can see the different curves based on the numbers of doses by day. Here's the curve for new death during the scenario of no vaccines compared to 300,000 doses per day, 1 million doses per day, and 5 million doses per day. You can imagine that we can create a similar graph where we can project the number of new deaths under current newborn screening policy and varying rates of new condition rollout. Models can be used to simulate a reasonable representation of real-life scenarios. For example, when considering whether a disease that is not currently included in newborn screening could benefit from early identification, decision modeling can be used to study the context and the complexity of this candidate condition and help inform the design of the pilot and help to generate evidence base for the recommended uniform screening panel nomination. We will highlight making the case for models in newborn screening. NBS2N conceived of and led an effort called the Newborn Screening Expansion Study that utilized a workshop of newborn screening experts, a survey of clinicians, a literature review, and a review of online resources and key efforts led by the Advisory Committee on Heritable Disorders in Newborns and Children, HRSA, CDC, and NICHD activities to understand the newborn screening expansion in the U.S. In the Newborn Screening Expansion Study Part 1 paper, we listed 4 challenges. The first one is variability in screening panel persists. Number 2, short duration of pilot limits information and intervention and health outcome. 3, recent RUS additions are expanding the definition of newborn screening. And 4th, the RUS nomination and evidence review process has capacity constraint. We encourage you to read our paper in the Frontiers in Genetics. See the website link below. To address the 4 challenges in Part 1, we conducted a literature review of models from a range of disciplines, including system science, management, artificial intelligence, and machine learning. The result from our analysis highlighted that there is at least one model which could be applied to each of the 4 factors that has delayed or complicated newborn screening expansion. This was published in Part 2, and here we highlight 4 key models. 1. Economic evaluation is a process of systematic identification, measurement, and evaluation of inputs and outputs of 2 alternative activities and a subsequent comparative analysis of these. Cost effectiveness is a process that examines both the cost and health outcome of one or more interventions and compares the intervention to another intervention by estimating how much it costs to gain a unit of health outcome. Cost-benefit analysis examines the costs and benefits, where benefits are converted into dollars to estimate the strength and the weaknesses of the alternatives. Budget impact analysis is a type of economic assessment that estimates the financial impact on operation on adopting a new intervention. Now, here's a reminder about some of our MBSN tools and resources that can help you as you consider using models in your efforts. These tools provide some of the basic inputs and outputs of your models and helps with the design of your modeling, which includes the LPDR, has a case level data on subjects with over 46 newborn screening conditions, and a list of question and answers used in natural history studies and pilots. The MBS VR has the estimated numbers of cases per state per year based on literature review and the CDC published birth rates for race categories. And the MBS CR contains 134 conditions, with 73 being candidates for screening and ready for modeling. Now that you have an idea of what modeling is and the MBS CRM tools, I'll describe two examples of the use of models. In our first example, we will look at newborn screening for severe combined immunodeficiency, also known as SCID, before the RUSS and after the RUSS. And number two is modeling for the RUSS nomination using the MBS CRM tool, MBS condition resources known as MBS CR for candidate conditions for pilots. Here, I'd like to show you the timeline of the application of models to support newborn screening for SCID. Before SCID was added to the RUSS, in the year 2005, there was a publication by McGee et al. At UCLA who conducted a cost-utility analysis. I was at NIH working with Dr. Jennifer Puck on the development of the newborn screening technology for SCID using TREC, and we published the methodology in the year 2005. In 2007, my dissertation on the development of TREC assay and the economic evaluation of population-based newborn screening for SCID was published. You can see the evidence of models before the RUSS, which provide information during the nomination for SCID. In the year 2010, SCID was added to the RUSS. And during this time, my manuscript on the cost-effective analysis using Markov models for newborn screening for SCID was under review and finally published in the year 2011. After SCID was added to the RUSS, several models were created to evaluate the true cost and benefit for screening for SCID. In 2016, a cost-effectiveness and net benefit analysis of recent implementation in the state of Washington was conducted. In 2019, a cost-effectiveness to advocate to support pilot studies in Netherlands was conducted. In 2019, a cost-effective analysis for screening for SCID in the UK was conducted. And last, and recently in 2022, Shin et al. Conducted a cost-effective analysis and budget impact analysis for SCID and SMA in Australia. SCID is a great test case for models, and it's so informative to see how models can be used throughout the RUSS process, both before and after. So how can you play a role in modeling? Well, you can help find the quantifiable numbers and inputs for the modeler to use. They can create the models and algorithms, but they need the clinical information, the quantifiable numbers, and the quality of life. So here's an example of modeling SCID before and after population-based screening. In this health state, which is called pre-symptomatic, patient doesn't exhibit any symptoms until they are clinically identified at the inpatient and outpatient states. There are probabilities and a utility associated with transitioning between states. What's the probability of a patient obtaining bone marrow transplant and having a successful outcome? The probability of a healthy outcome or a death would depend on the previous health states. Here, let's go over the second example of how to use models for a recommended uniform screening panel known as RUSS nomination using the MBS CR candidate conditions for pilots. Modeling can be used to project health outcomes during a research pilot, a RUSS nomination, implementation pilot, state adoption pilots, and nationwide implementation. All of these important steps leads to newborn screening expansion. For the case of modeling for a pilot study, what if we can conduct a pilot study to screen for a condition until we find one case and follow the case for treatment? This will provide preliminary data on the analytical validity of the screening test. Once we find one case, we can use the modeling to examine the net benefits due to screening and model long-term follow-up over time. Using models, we can conduct a 20-year natural history, and model all types of outcomes such as disease cured, not cured, and understand the monthly costs of treatment and management of care. The benefits of modeling is that it could reduce time, resources, and costs. Here's a graphical display of a decision analysis model, which is used as a visual display of all the possible outcomes and consequences that might follow each options. We can explore the different parameters under different scenarios, such as to screen or not to screen. We can explore the costs and benefits of using a specific test for identifying the true positive. For a new condition to be recommended to the RUS, there are many steps that has to happen. Modeling can be used before the RUS, during the RUS process, and after the RUS to help inform newborn screening policy and practice. The NBS steering tool can provide key data points. Data from the LPDR can provide net benefits. The NBS VR can provide incidents, and the NBS CR can provide information related to candidate conditions. Here is a screenshot of where you can find the NBS CRN tool to learn more about the conditions. The information can be used to derive variables and inputs for the models. You can also filter by nomination status. You can identify conditions based on whether they have a RUS core or whether they're RUS secondary or they're rather a candidate condition. On the RUS nomination form, there are different fields that are information that can be extrapolated as model inputs as they're related to the definition of the condition, the screening parameters, and the treatment, as well as the screening process for analytical validity, clinical utility, and prospective pilot data, laboratory screening, confirmatory testing, and pilot study. So when completing these forms, it may be helpful to have someone who can assist with the model design. An external group called the Evidence-Based Review Group, ERG, collects data, creates a final report, and presents the report to the committee. One of the questions is, what are the clinical effects of early detection and treatment for the condition? The ERC will conduct a systematic evidence review. This methodology includes a review of published and unpublished reports. In the third column, these are my suggestions on the use of models as described in our paper published in the Frontier in Genetics. For examples, information can be used to understand the health states, such as disease stage 1, disease stage 2, etc., and the presence or absence of early detection or early treatment to determine the net benefit in the model. The second question is, how would newborn screening for the condition affect the population? The ERG will conduct a decision analysis model. This method uses data to predict how adding screening would affect the U.S. population of newborns. In the model, we can also examine incidence during status quo versus estimated incident, how it changes in the presence of newborn screening. The third question is, how would adding a newborn screening service for the condition affect the public health system? The ERG will use information to conduct a public health system impact analysis. This method involves gathering information from state newborn screening programs about adding screenings for the condition. Models can be used to understand the feasibility, the readiness for expansion, understanding the human capital that's needed, infrastructure, operational process. A budget impact analysis can be explored to examine the impact of expanding screening. So in summary, before the RUS, we can create simulation population-based models based on literature search, expert opinions. During the submission process, we can create simulation models based on pilot studies, operational factors and costs, implementation factors and costs, management of long-term care from population-based perspective. And after RUS, we can also create cost-effective models based on real-time data, operational costs, implementation costs, and sustainability costs. In our paper, we also provided additional use cases for other conditions, so I encourage you to go to the link and download the article. And here's a list of several software for modeling, but not limited to Microsoft Excel, MATLAB, SAS, SPSS, Triage, Venson, and AnyLogic. Also, the MBSN provides a network for collaboration with researchers, clinicians, system scientists, modeler, health economists, advocates, parents, families, and the MBS student staff. Once you register, you need to activate your account to join the forum. Currently, we have over 490 members in the forum. So please become a member of the MBS student community because we need to work together because it takes a village to save a child. Thank you for your time. I'm happy to take any questions now.
Thank you, Dr. Chen, for that presentation. We are taking questions now. You can feel free to either enter your question in the chat or you can raise your hand and we'll call on you and you can unmute yourself. So Dr. Chen, I think there's first question in the chat for you already. It says, can you, and it's about posting a link to the articles. I see that it's posted and I see Amy just posted it. Dr. Brower posted it.
Thank you. Mhm.
While we're waiting on questions, I'll go ahead. Oh, here we have one from Jeremy. How do you handle uncertainty in the models? There are often lots of guesses that have to be made when developing models, especially for conditions that are rare.
That's an excellent question, Jeremy, and that's often a common question that we get when we model. So models, you can think of it as a way to project all different scenarios and to address the uncertainty is in models, you conduct a sensitivity analysis, and that is a type of analysis where you test a range of numbers. So let's say you have a base case number or baseline, and then you don't know if it's going to move up or down, right? This from this value. And so you conduct a series of different points within this range, like so basically a standard deviation, and then you run through the model, and that provides you information to know that at what point does it tip, and then does it tip the model to be no longer cost effective or that's no longer effective, and so you can run all these different analysis. And another what's important about that type of analysis is that you can then test really quickly which of the parameters is most sensitive. Is it the if you're looking at screening tests, is it the specificity? Is it the sensitivity of the test? Is it incidence? Or is it the cost of treatment? Or is the cost of long-term care? So you can test all these important parameters by increasing the range and within reason. And so how do you determine that? So this is where you would, for example, if there's information from literature review, if there's raw data, or you can even talk with experts. You often use expert opinions to create that range to conduct a sensitive analysis in the model.
Can I ask a follow-up to that? I know one of your examples was with SCID, and I know it was the cost analysis that was done beforehand, and then I think it was a cost effectiveness analysis that was done after it was added to the RUS. Was there any differences that were seen between the two models, or were they answering two different questions so they can't be compared?
In terms of the outcome, they both show that it's cost effective, so that's good. So that is reassuring that it was a good decision to screen for SCID. What you oftentimes see in terms of the type of cost effectiveness that's done for a specific state is that each state program might have different specific costs as it relates to its operation. So the budget impact analysis for screening for a certain condition in the state of Washington, might differ from another state. For example, in the state of Texas, which has a larger population and may have different, the way how the screening workflow may work differently. And so that information is important because then what happens is that states who may be very similar in size, similar in operation, can then see like, oh, well, if it costs this much to implement, our cost would be either twice as much, half as much. And so that is very informative. But in terms of the answer where it's cost effectiveness, these type of studies continue to show that it was a very good decision, a very cost effective decision to screen for SCID. Any other questions here? I see some. questions. I see some questions that are messaged directly to me. So I'll just share those questions. I won't say who they are since they were messaged directly to me. One of them was related to, has there been type of modeling done directly as it relates to newborn screening and hearing? I haven't worked in that particular area, but I believe that there has been. I mean, when I was doing my dissertation work, I read a wealth of different type of studies looking at newborn screening. Since then, it's been a decade. There's been a wealth of new interventions and type of screening tests that's been on horizon. So I think that new type of cost-effective analysis as it relates to new screening platforms, perhaps the use of genomic type of platforms for hearing loss could be explored. There's another question by someone who asks about what are some underlying data sets and assumptions used in tools? And one, in terms of the assumptions, that kind of relates back to the first question that relates to uncertainty. So when you're considering conducting a cost-effective model or a cost utility model and any type of analysis that I presented in the very beginning, and you would hope that there's a lot of already clinical information because that's going to really what builds the model. But if you don't have all the information because it's either for various reasons, maybe there's not enough cases, it's a very rare disease, or either that there just hasn't been a prospective study, you can then get some information either from talking to clinicians. So that's where expert opinions becomes very important as part of inputs to the model. There was a question that relates to Pompe, looking at late and onset. So for example, that's currently being screened. So perhaps it's been screened. And so talking with clinicians who are caring for the patient who are identified as late onset Pompe, those perhaps they haven't manifested the disease symptoms yet, connecting to those clinicians, perhaps they're part of the NVSR network, you can connect with them to understand what are some of the not direct medical costs because their symptoms aren't exhibit yet, right? So maybe there's surveillance, maybe there's more close management, maybe there's more occupational type of health services if it relates to any type of any additional help that's needed. And so understanding that there's other types of services that might be included because it's late onset is important to the model. Now for early onset, those would be very direct, right? Because they've been identified through newborn screening and there's either medical intervention quickly being provided. You might be able to have those type of data analysis really quickly because the clinicians are caring for those patients. So there's going to take, so this type of model will require a various different types of data, right? You have data that's direct because you actually have the clinical information, and there might be some information that's going to be more projected based on clinicians' expert opinions. Well, I imagine that if this is going to be a late onset, we may have to have X, Y, and Z type of management of care, more closer surveillance. So those are projected type of clinical intervention. And so it's a combination of these different data points that we use into the model.
So there's several other I don't know if you have other questions too, but there's several questions that I can help you.
Those are the two that was directly to me, but yeah.
Okay, so there's several other questions that were in the chat. One is talking about test availability for multiplexing. So can you talk about how that would fit into the a potential model for newborn screening?
Oh, yeah. So that's an excellent type of model question, right? So you can look at status quo, which is right now, maybe each condition has its own assay. And then you would have one of the decisions, which would be looking at multiplexing, if that exists. Then you might have the actual cost of the reagents, the cost of time, the cost of processing. Now, that's an example where you can have true cost comparing existing assays with an existing multiplexing assay. Now, if the multiplexing assay doesn't exist yet, models could still be used, right? Because you could project, well, at what point would it make sense to develop a multiplexing assay in order to reduce cost? Now, if it's already cost effective to screen using a single assay, you have to think about how can we make it even more cost effective, right, to multiplex. Now, I think the assumption is that multiplexing is less expensive, but is that really true? Because you're going to have a new machinery, you're going to have you're going to have to train the personnel at the state program. There might be additional processing time. So those are other costs to consider if you're going to multiplex. So these are important questions that policymakers or stakeholders who are considering using multiplexing might want to consider changing a whole system if they're going to use multiplexing.
Jennifer and Key, this is Bob Vogt. May I interject a question here? Hi.
Sure.
It's directly related to the question that was you were just addressing, and I think so very important from the laboratory standpoint. So when Key developed and colleagues developed the SCID test, it was actually the first DNA primary test in the history of newborn screening. It's kind of funny because it was a DNA test, but it wasn't really a genetic test. And then shortly thereafter, 3 or 4 years later, attention turned to spinal muscular atrophy. And at that time, Jennifer Taylor had come to our place for a postdoctoral position, and she multiplexed SMA into Key's SCID test. And I'm not sure I'm right about this, but I believe the uptake for adding SMA among the state programs in the United States has been perhaps the most rapid ever. And it really is, the thumbs up, that's very important. And it really is, from the standpoint, if you were standing there in the lab watching people do stuff, you wouldn't see any difference if they were testing only for SCID or for SCID and SMA. Now, there are lots of other variables involved in newborn screening, the pre-analytical and post-analytical and so forth. But as far as the test being done, and we talked about together, and Jennifer will remember this, we had a meeting with one of our sponsors that had developed one of the first treatments for SMA about should we do a different method, and with that other method, we would be able to pick up these 5 to 10% of genetic variants that are not picked up by the current screen, which is limited to the exon 7 changes. And so there was a discussion about that, and we made the decision jointly that we would stick with multiplexing for SCID and with the SCID test. And I think that decision has saved, I'm going to say, dozens of lives of infants that would have had type 1 SMA had they not been uncovered by newborn screening. So that aspect of laboratory operations is very important. And I just wanted to use, since we happen to have the two people who created those things here running this program, it's a very nice way for things to have come together.
Thank you, Dr. Voigt, for sharing that. Yeah, I mean, that's an example where adding another condition into an existing assay and multiplexing, but it didn't increase the cost of operation. So that's a good example that it's cost effective, and there's numerous publications to support the screening for SCID and SMA on a platform, and that has been very successful. Yeah.
Yes, thanks, Dr. Vogt, for the shout out. That was great.
Yeah.
Me and Key make a great team.
I know. I still remember meeting Dr. Voigt like when I was a PhD student. That was way back then, but yeah.
So Cindy has a good question about the role of advocacy groups play. Cindy, you want to unmute yourself? You have an interesting, can you explain more about the cross purpose that you put in your note in the chat?
Sure. Hope you all can hear me.
Yep.
I'm no longer working actively in newborn screening, but it was always difficult to work collaboratively with advocates who were bound and determined to add something legislatively to the screening panel when all of the work hadn't been done. And it seemed to take a lot of effort to help them to understand what goes into it, that adding a condition is not as simple as, oh, it's only one more test and it'll only cost $4.39. And you end up not having the world's best relationships unless you can kind of nurture those relationships. So I'd be interested to hear what Dr. Chan has to say, or any of the rest of you. How do we best work with advocates so that everybody wins?
I know Dr. Chan will have a comment, but Cindy, I love that question. I think even for myself as a medical geneticist and a parent, when I was on the advisory committee, I was sort of in that, why aren't you advocating for SCID newborn screening? And was sort of like, I'm not sure we're ready. I'm not sure we have all the sort of details of what happens after a screen, because as you all have taught us, newborn screening is a system and it just begins with the screening. And so I'll let Dr. Chan add to that. But great point.
Cindy, thank you for sharing that. So the question is, what does the role of advocates play in this process of modeling? I say a huge part. And and that's why I think this platform of sharing the use of model in this call, and we post on our YouTube channel, is to kind of share the message that it's a collaboration across all the different stakeholders, because you can have the clinicians who have the clinical data, and then you have the researchers such as ourselves developing the test, developing therapy, developing the models, and then you have the modelers who are doing the actual models. But there's a lot of information that the advocacy groups who are advocating on the behalf of parents and that have information that are not published, that are not even in the clinical data. Perhaps it's the quality of life, right? So what are other needs that are beyond medical interventions that families needs and that the advocacy organization are advocating for? Maybe it relates to education, maybe it relates to nutrition, maybe it relates to other types of the aligned health professions like occupational speech therapy. So there's a lot of other information that we don't have. And I think working with advocacy group is very important because they're advocating on the needs and the wants of families. And so those are important information that we would need to have. So I wouldn't think that when you say that's sometimes it feels like we're at a cross purpose. I think I like to think of it that we're in a very synergetic, they're creating synergy so they can work together, be able to share information. So you can create things that are much more meaningful to them. Mm-hmm.
And I think one thing we've been advocating for, and you all have been helping us, is at the advisory committee level. So they look at when a new condition comes up for nomination usually by these days, advocacy groups, they look at the public health impact. Well, we've been working in our subcommittees of the advisory committee to talk to them about the clinical care impact, the community impact, the family impact. So there's much more that goes along with adding something to screening. And screening, don't get me wrong, is, a critical, huge first step. But I think in the models that Dr. Chan is developing, it really looks at the entire system. And so thinking about, what's survival rates, do they need help in school? What do we do to take care of these kids and families? And how do we help the communities get ready for all of these new conditions that we hear coming down the pike?
This is Cindy again. It strikes me that it would be nice to have like boilerplate information for advocates saying something like, thank you for your interest in such and such. And I'd love to inform you what goes into adding a condition at the state level, not to the RUSP. The RUSP is not the primary concern. And here are all the things to consider. And perhaps we can work together, something like that.
I think that's a great idea, Cindy. And I think in your work in the Regional Genetics Network and with, the boot camp that APHL New Steps and EveryLife work on together every year, we can make sure that we kind of highlight that. We are working with several advocacy groups right now that have, because, MBSTRN is a little bit on the research side, but the research side comes before and after the RUSP, because we learn so much about diseases once it goes to nationwide screening. But thinking about before the RUSP, we're working with several advocacy groups, and they don't always like my feedback, because I always, sort of think of screening has to fit right now. If you're trying to do a newborn screen, it really has to fit within the state programs. It has to fit with what you guys do so well, and they really have to adapt their screening or their assays or their approach to really fit into that system, unless they're trying to, come up with something that's completely different. That will be, I think, a little bit harder to do. We could definitely work on it on the research side, but if they're kind of thinking near-term RUST nomination, it's really got to fit into the models that you guys have all developed. And I think that's part of what, Key is developing, is her models then go back to the advocacy groups, and they may have a few more years of research to do before they're ready to submit a RUST nomination. But in the long run, that saves them time, because they don't go through the whole nomination and then get turned down or back for more evidence. The model kind of gives you can set your own research agenda and then think about how to really produce that evidence. I think one of the things we've tried to do with the tools on our website is give you some of those baseline data points. We need more data points, so that's what we're working with advocacy groups to get some of those economic factors and other things that we can build in to the models. But I hope you get a chance to check out those tools and kind of think about maybe how they could help with the individuals and stakeholders that you all talk to, because our tools are, made for the community, and we want to make sure that they make sense.
Thank you all.
Thank you, Cindy. And I'm going to move on to the next question from Kate Tullis. Kate, this is a great question because it addresses a lot of the breadth of what a model can do. And models can answer so many different questions. That this is something that I'm learning from you. And her question, she talks about with the conditions, so the newer conditions that are being added to the RUST, they may require sequencing. And some of these conditions are very rare, and how will they account for VUSs and the potential medicalization from infants? Long-term follow-up, how is where diagnosis and treatment can take place, including the modeling. And when I read this question, there's so many different things a model could address, like sensitivity with including or in specificity when you include a second-tier testing versus not second-tier testing, and then as well as the treatment options and things like that. So Kate, if you have any other comments you want to add into this, feel free to unmute yourself. And then, Key, we would like to hear your feedback on this question.
Hey, hi, Key and Jennifer. Thanks for taking my question. This is just something I think about all the time with these newer conditions. Like, how am I in little old Delaware going to get a kid to somewhere far away to be treated, and then I have to present that to Medicaid, which is also a whole nother deal. It scares me. Anyways, I'd love to hear your input.
So the models can be a way to help plan for planning. So it sounds to me that the fear is not so much of what the model can or can't do, but like, is there a process to provide treatment for that family? Like, it sounds to me like either they have to travel, or if there is only regional areas. And so I think those type of factors are important when designing a model, even before the addition to the rest, because that way you can kind of see what are the infrastructure that's needed. So it's not to say too that if infrastructure doesn't exist, we shouldn't screen, but it's a way to plan so that we know that, okay, if there's only regional centers that provide treatment and they're all located in the middle, well, that's an example, then that might mean that we need to project to have funding to support infrastructure for regional centers that are in both of the east and west coast. So that's an example of like maybe having more treatment center more widely located. I mean, we can also consider that type of model looking at areas that are, most of the treatment center are in urban areas. And so how do you reach out to rural area? Well, then you might build a model, look at, well, we built new regional centers in all rural areas, but then if the incident, like you said, is very rare, maybe that doesn't make sense. Maybe we can invest in a transportation type of of intervention instead. So models provide a roadmap of all possible scenarios, and that way you have a roadmap to then ask for funding, ask for resources, or even start planning what would be ideal for these families. Because if families, let's say there are regional areas, but if they can't pick up and leave their job, then that's not a feasible option either. So we have to really start thinking about not only just screening early and early treatment, but is it feasible for the families, and considering all the other type of important factors, such as the social determinants of health, which are the economics, the environment, how that plays a role in the health outcomes.
Yes,
as
and
well.
to me, that sounds a lot like what would have to happen on a national level.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Oh, you mean in terms of providing these type of options?
Regional
Yeah.
centers. I
Yeah.
mean,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so these models are a way to kind of graphically display what are all the different roadmaps. And so if funding is needed at a national level, you then have a roadmap to show, what are all the different possibilities. Mhm.
Yeah, I just wanted to keep on that discussion going. This is a great example of this last question of how, models can be used across of different aspects in the system of newborn screening as a whole. So, we're talking about, after the screening is complete, seeing if there's funding for the short-term follow-up and maybe even the long-term follow-up pieces, planning that out before, screening takes in effect. And it also can be used also to say, hey, should the program be, should they be considering, a second tier sequencing test? Is that going to do more good or more harm? Is that going to increase our specificity and sensitivity? Is it going to decrease it? So that last question is a great one to show that, you can at least look at barriers and gaps within the program for different aspects of the system.
And also with screening, with screening, you may actually identify the true incidents, right? And because there might be cases that we have missed because we didn't capture them. The deaths, the infant died. And so that's also in consideration that, the model, that you built before the rest or during the rest, the information may change because you might actually identify more. And in that case, with that information, that's also another way to implement the model to justify we need additional funds to support the short-term and long-term care than what was projected before the rest when we developed that model.
Key, this is Bob again, a totally different question now, not lab related. Do any of your models take into account the cost of the post-analytical, basically the intervention, the treatment, prevention of the condition that was detected by newborn screening? When SMA came up for discussion, the treatments for that were very expensive. And that topic was talked about a great deal. And I know of a couple programs, Jennifer, I know also is aware of programs that were worried how they would pay for the therapies to treat the infants, the newborns identified with SMA. More recently, there's something from England, from the United Kingdom, about metachromatic leukodystrophy, where the cost of the treatment was $3 million. And so to what extent do you, and Key, particularly as an economist, I guess, I mean, I know that you all can assign monetary values to a life or some way of working that into the modeling of decision making of that sort. Do you have any perspective on that you could share?
Yeah, so Dr. Voigt, the cost of treatment or management of care is taken into account when, at least the models that I worked on, it depends on the economic question for each models, but the models, as you see, that I showed today, I looked at for display only, I just looked at the model for today's presentation, looking at how much it costs to identify a true positive. So that's one question that you can use to model. You can also do the same model. I could have extended that model to look at, okay, after they're identified true positive, what's the cost of care? And so that was the other model that I showed about the SCID, which is like, you know, once you identify someone with the condition, what's the probability of getting treatment? So in case of SCID, it was bone marrow transplant. So even if they got bone marrow transplant, what's the probability of a successful transplant? And so there's a lot of factor that goes into that, right? The actual facility, the type of treatment, the actual like the prognosis of the actual patient, and so all the other conditions like the health status. So all of that is taken into consideration too, if that's part of the modeling, is looking at the treatment. And you can also look at across afterwards, like across the lifespan, which is you can do a 20-year natural history. So after treatment, let's say this is happening within the first year, you get screened, you get treated, and this is a 1-year time horizon. You can also use the models to look at, okay, now that they got treated, and when we say that 50% of them had very successful rates, so got 90% survival, how would they live for the next 5 to 10 or 20 years? And maybe there's a second group that, okay, they did okay, but they're going to have a second transplant. Okay, so that's a second group. And how would they do if they got a second transplant 5, 10, 20 years ago? And this is all done through a model. So that's another question that you can also look at, is to look at the overall lifespan of an individual that you can model across time. And then you can also have different interventions that you can add to it, like if they got, you know, you can also look at the social determinants of health along this model. You know, even if they were given transplant, if they weren't close to a local grocery store, you know, we know that social determinants of health has a huge impact on health. What are their access to nutrition, their access to green space, you know, and all of that has a very important component to development of someone's well-being. And so you can also model the social determinants of health as it impacts the success of long-term follow-up. So there's a lot of different ways you can model. You can create models to answer a lot of different economic questions. But yes, we do take into account, if that is the question, to look at the effects of early treatment versus status quo, the current treatment, given the presence or absence of newborn screening.
Thank you, Key. I have some more questions on that. I'll get back to you.
Yeah, no, this is great. Thank you, Dr. Boyd. We appreciate your questions. Mm-hmm.
And then Ryan has a question which it kind of goes along the lines of the last question, and he's talking about the responsibility of assumptions in the model. And Key, can you also define for us too, you talk about there's assumptions, but then there's also variables. Can you talk a little bit about the difference between the both of them in your models?
Yeah, so a variable could be, for example, let's say, I'm going to use a case example that we use today, which is SCID. So let's say, you know, when back then we were working on our project, in my model, we assumed that the incidence was, let's say, 1 in 50,000, right? And so 1 in 50,000 is SCID. And then based on different publication at that time, some said that it was 1 in 75,000, some said it was maybe close to 1 in 50, depending on some areas. Maybe in Europe it was like 1 in 100,000. So that's actual numbers that people have determined based on their prospective study. So those are variables that you can actually put into the model, because you're testing, well, you know, what's this range. Now assumptions could be that, well, this is the base case, but do we really know what the incidence is? Because we haven't really done a prospective study. And so you may look at, okay, so this disease is very similar to this other disease. Well, I'm going to assume that the base case is maybe 1 in 40,000. So it's 1 in 40,000. So, you know, and maybe PKU, which is currently being screened, their incidence is maybe close to 1 in 10,000. So if I make the variable between 1 in 40 to 1 in 10,000, and maybe up to 1 in 50,000, because that's SCID is currently being screened, you know, I mean, now we determined that the incidence is actually not as rare as 1 in 50,000. But so that's a way how you can create an assumption of an incident if you don't actually have all the actual data that's either published, or you don't have clinical information because it's just very rare, or people just haven't collected enough information. There hasn't been enough patients to know about what will be the actual clinical manifestation of someone with that disease. So that's an example of making assumptions that's kind of based on a proxy to a disease, based on what you have to run a model. And then the question might be, well, if this model is based on all these assumptions, how true can it be? Well, that's what a model does. It just projects. It gives you information. It gives you a roadmap. So that way that you know that, okay, well, if disease is 1 in 40,000, but the treatment is very inexpensive, maybe it's okay that the incident is like 1 in 40,000. Now, if the incident is 1 in 40,000, but the treatment is very, very expensive, then maybe in this case, we have to look at the two different variables, which is do we decrease the cost, or we try to find more cases, right? So those two internal factors really influence whether something is considered going to be considered cost effective or not. So that's how modelers use data. If there's existing data, if there isn't, we use proxy to make some assumptions to then see in the simulated world what would be cost effective. And then with the information, you again can propose in real life, we would need to collect real data to inform this model to see if this is true. And this is commonly done. I mean, if you look at the whole COVID pandemic, there's a lot of assumptions that was made in terms of vaccination rate, who to vaccinate, when to vaccinate, who to vaccinate first, right? And so people make these informed policy decision really based on a lot of assumptions. And then we kind of test it, and we test it over time. We see how right we are, or how much information we need to be more informed next time.
Brian, does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's just, models by their nature are meant to be living things that we continue to iterate on as we get more data. And so
Exactly.
I know I personally get frustrated when people don't state assumptions in models, or do not share what the sources of the data are. And I think that those kinds of things can be really valuable for not that they're wrong, but hey, we're basing it on this prevalence rate coming from this source, and this is the strength of that source. We can easily replace it or parameterize it to be replaced with a different value as a higher value or a higher quality source comes along later on. But we can't, but we don't know what goes, some of these models have multiple sources depending on what you're looking at. So how do you responsibly share all that stuff? Or maybe it was just a plug for saying, hey, anybody doing modeling, please be responsible and share your assumptions, share your data sources, give people the credit for the work that they've done, but then also allow other people to know what information is built into that model, and they may be wanting to change or prefer a different source than that one.
Yeah, I mean, I know in most publications of models, journals do require the information provided either directly as part of the methods to see where the source of the data comes from, and sometimes as part of supplementary material to provide the actual data if there's assumptions. So I think in peer-reviewed journals, they do require that. Now, where it gets a little fuzzy is that if these models is displayed on CNN, there just isn't room to discuss all the sources and the data. But I think the purpose of that, when it's displayed more in a broader context, is to not go over the data sources, but how the policy is informed with some statistics or some models to inform that policy.
Well, thank you, Key. This has been a very lively discussion. I know we're at the top of our hour, and if you have time, I was just going to give people a couple minutes to do our announcements, and then we can get off. So I was going to share my screen really quickly, and if we could briefly go through these announcements. Let me see if I can find the slides again. That's the trick. So Key or Amy, did you want to go through the announcements?
I can go through it. So we have a Newborn Screening Spotlight podcast, and we're very excited that we have our latest episode with Yvonne Carl, who she shares her advocacy work for newborn screening research and treatment for sickle cell disease. In this podcast, she shares her personal story and areas that we need to continue to work together to advocate for patients and families with sickle cell disease. And she also talks about a nursing boot camp that she runs, and you can also learn more about that information. And also she focuses also on the social determinants of health on sickle cell disease patients. So definitely take a listen to our podcast. Please share and subscribe. And we're very excited that we have our upcoming network meeting in a couple weeks now, mid-May, May 18, 19, which is a Thursday and Friday from 12 to 4 p.m. Eastern time. Please register for this network meeting. We're really excited that we're celebrating the 60th anniversary of newborn screening. And here are some upcoming events too that we like to share. May 15th and 19th is Public Health Genetics and Genomics Weeks. May 17th, we have ACMG Student Education Series. If you know of a student who's interested in public health and genetics, please connect them with us. We can provide the information with them. We're also excited that we have MBSN, Dr. Amy Brown, who's going to be presenting at the International Conference on Women's Health on the potential for genomics and newborns to transform maternal child care. And on May 16th, we have the Mountain State Regional Genetics, and we have Dr. Dieter Materna, who will be talking about the 60-year newborn screening in a nutshell. So we encourage you to attend our network meeting. You can see it that the registration is on the chat. So if you can register now, even when I'm talking, please register for the network meeting. And also please check out some of the events by some of our members at MBS Strand. And follow us on social media. We're on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and LinkedIn and Twitter. Mm-hmm.
And our next meeting will be next month, June 1st will be the next call. So thank you everybody for attending. I know we went a little over time, and you enjoy the rest of your day.